12. Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle over him. He left the oxen, ran after Elijah, and said, "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." Then Elijah said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" He returned from following him, took the yoke of oxen, and slaughtered them. Using the equipment from the oxen, he boiled their flesh and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out and followed Elijah and became his servant. The second reading is from 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 6 through 15. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they were both standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, and the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. He picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water. He said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Where is he?" He struck the water again, and the water was parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha crossed over. When the company of prophets who were at Jericho saw him at a distance, they declared, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." They came to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. The word of God for the people of God.
Well, it's one of those things where after studying, I knew this story sort of, but after studying up on Elijah and Elisha this week, I think in my spare time I must lead a study on these prophets. They're like the superhero prophets of the Old Testament found in 1st and 2nd Kings. There actually are comic books on them, and it seems a suitable way to present them. Long before broadcast or miniseries on streaming services and the Marvel Universe movies that are out there, there were remarkable stories like just the two we heard about these, and they were known for their zeal. They were zealous defenders of the faith that were told, these stories were told around campfires, in homes at bedtime. I'm not sure you'd tell some of these before bedtime because they're like, they ramp you up, they don't put you to sleep. But they would have been bedtime stories, and they could have been told around the table at special dinners. Elijah is remembered at the Passover meal, for example. So to paraphrase an old Superman saying, these two prophets were all about truth, justice, and the Israelite way. I couldn't. I really wanted to include this snippet of story out of the Old Testament for today's message. And you'll hear in just a minute we get to sing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" that's based on this story. We don't get to sing it very often, but it's a good one. Now, I first got to know about Elijah when I was a junior leader in the vacation Bible school that we always had. We held it out in the park. It was outdoors. And we were able to stage a very dramatic telling of the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. That's one of the main stories about him. And it's out of chapter 18 in 1 Kings. And in that story, basically, Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to really a duel, except that their challenge is to set a sacrifice, a bull, on fire without touching it. Well, the prophets of Baal have no luck. But in our story, we were able to miraculously make a paper bag bull that was on one of those, freestanding grills in a park. We set it on fire. So that was my first introduction really to Elijah and the story. So in that story, Elijah is proving that the Jews, the Israelites, were following a false god in Baal. They kept wanting to go off over there and follow. Baal was a Canaanite god, and he was telling them, no, he's a false god. He can't even light this bull on fire. In fact, I love in the story, Elijah actually douses his bull with water to make it even harder to light on fire. But fire rains down from the heavens. The thing gets set on fire. It's a great story, okay? And in other stories, Elijah performs miracles. He even raises a boy from the dead. In this one, you saw him parting the waters with his mantle. There are many echoes in our gospel stories about these things as well. So it's not amazing if sometimes in the New Testament, people ask Jesus, are you Elijah? Because this is one of their heroes, and they know their stories, and they know that he's like Elijah in many ways. Now, it's time to clue you in on how this Old Testament story of these two superheroes relates to our series, and I'm the last of the series of the Happy to Be Here series. If you recall, Pastor Kathy, Pastor Harley, and I took turns talking about why we were happy to be here. You heard Eric talk about why he's happy to be here today. We've had some dialogue about that. So we asked for your responses for why you like staying here, being here, and we heard from you why you're happy to be a United Methodist and a member of this particular church community. One response that Pastor Kathy talked about 2 weeks ago was reconciliation, how this church helps people come together and stay together and work on it through reconciliation, even when it's hard. Last week, Pastor Harley talked about the sense of community found in churches as well, another trait that draws and keeps us here. Here at this church, we find our people, those who love us as we are, who will help us and will be with us through thick and thin. The third characteristic of Wall Street and the United Methodist Church in general that you guys gave was discipleship and mentoring that people find here on their Christian journey. And perhaps now you're beginning to see about why I included these verses about Elijah and Elisha in this transition from one generation to the next in these readings from the Old Testament. The transition doesn't happen magically. I know that in the Elijah and Elisha story, it's pretty magical. But the reality is that mentoring and discipleship are deliberate things that must take place so the faith is passed along. Often when we speak of the passing of authority and power from the older generation to the younger generation, we call it passing the mantle. And it goes way back. I don't remember, I haven't looked it up, but how long ago this story would have taken place, thousands of years. Back to this story where, and you can see in the picture, it's red in this picture, the mantle is literally being given to the younger prophet. It flies off Elijah as he's going off into heaven in the flaming chariot, and it's being passed to Elisha down here on earth. So when we were talking about mentoring, discipleship and mentoring, of course, this story popped into my head. There were, of course, other stories I could have chosen from our Bible. Earlier in the Old Testament, there's a transition from Moses to Joshua. Moses knows he's not going to make it to the promised land, and he prepares Joshua for the task of leading the Israelites to their new homeland. And then in the first 4 books of the New Testament, what we call the Gospels, we have the story of Jesus' earthly ministry, how he gathered his disciples together and prepared them step by step for what would ultimately become the Christian church that started after his death and resurrection. Paul, later in the New Testament, is another one who has people that he mentors. They join him on his missionary journey. So the church has wisely, over the years, paid attention to this model because Moses, Elijah, Paul, and Jesus used it. We think it's fine. It's good for us too. So it's a way to grow and add followers. Now, that mantle is another word for cloak. In biblical times, a mantle was typically a large, loose-fitting garment made of animal skins. This one looks like it's actually woven, but you can't really tell. Probably a sheepskin. Prophets were known for wearing mantles as a sign of their calling. And in that story we had where he was calling Elijah, he throws his cloak around him as a symbol of Elijah's ministry being passed to Elisha. The prophet's mantle was a sign of his authority and responsibility as God's chosen spokesperson. So Elijah would have known this, and therefore he's not confused when Elijah shows up and throws a coat over top of him. Okay? That's something that was done. And it also explains why Elijah at once gives up farming. 12 yoke of oxen, that's 24 cows. And so he immediately kills all the cows. He actually chops up his farming equipment and has a big bonfire so he can cook them. He feeds everybody. He says goodbye to his parents. And even though Elijah goes, no, I'm not sure you want to follow me, he does. And then in the second story, we see literally that mantle fall from the sky as Elijah is taken off into the heavens in a whirlwind, riding in that chariot of fire. Elijah is the only one in the whole Bible that never dies. He just goes off to heaven. And that's why they were always kind of waiting for Elijah to come back. After that, it was Elisha's mantle, and he uses it, as you heard in the story, to part the waters and join the people that he's going to be leading. Now, thousands of years later, we should not get too literal about mentoring and discipleship based on this one story. Not everyone here today is going to be a prophet. You're not all going to get a sheepskin. And really, there's no need. We could have organized a walk down to the Ohio to see if somebody could part the waters. But we can agree on one thing, that you and your pastors at Wall Street value the privilege of raising up the next generation so that the church goes on into the future. I wrestled with the subtle difference between discipleship, which is kind of how this was labeled, and mentoring, which is really what I was hearing people talking about when I was getting ready for this sermon. I looked in the hymnal, and for example, there's a bunch of hymns on discipleship, but they're about like personal discipleship, following Jesus. I'm going to follow Jesus. Both of these are needed. The word disciple has to do with things like apostle and sermon, not sermon, student. So it's more about learning, more about education. The emphasis is on following Jesus and then learning about God in worship services and in lessons, like in Sunday school classes and other classes that you might have, and then like music camp. So those are like educational to a great extent. Mentoring, on the other hand, is related, but it's different. It involves learning, for sure, but a mentor is experienced and a trusted advisor who provides guidance, advice, feedback, assistance, and then works with what we call the mentee to figure out what worked and didn't work, so they can help analyze things with somebody. It's based more on a relationship, and I think you see in this, if you go through the stories, there's more of a relationship there. It's by following somebody that we learn. Aren't formal lessons, but watching and listening, trying things out, having encouragement, having someone to be honest with you as you grow. The example that came to my mind was when I taught photography. I had a class that actually was an independent study, and I was more of a mentor than a teacher. Quite honestly, I didn't know everything that my students needed or wanted to learn. Many of them were already on the way to being better photographers than I am. I'm proud to say a couple of them are professional photographers these days. But they were young adults ready to go out on their own. They were juniors or seniors. And so my idea was to have lessons that guided them to becoming independent in their photography. I had a few basics. I insisted on things had to be in focus. You wouldn't believe how many people pass off bad photography as, I don't know, art or something, but I insisted on things being in focus. Unless they needed to be artsy, they were supposed to be in focus. They needed to meet some deadlines. If I gave an assignment, they had to meet a deadline. And the finished photos at the very end had to be cropped to sizes that you could actually print and put in a frame, which is harder than you think. I was there to answer questions. I could point them in the right direction during class. And really, almost one of my favorite moments, and it was every year, no matter what kids I had, I would say, okay, you need to choose 5 photos that you want us to print and frame, and you'll put them on the wall. And they'd look at me like, what? How could I do that? They want me to do the picking. At that point, all year long, they've been doing this. And then suddenly they couldn't possibly choose their own photos. And of course, this was the ultimate handoff. I wanted them to be able to decide what they liked and what was worthy. And I always insisted that they do it. I tell them they can do it. You can do it. It's that sort of relationship that mentoring is. Several years ago, I was privileged to sit around a campfire one night at a retreat as the participants spoke about people that had helped them grow as Christians. They also shared what sort of things helped them in their growth. Thinking of that, I asked several friends here to share their experience in a similar way about being mentored in the Christian walk. They didn't fail me. They came through. I'll start with the definition our friend Marilyn Gavin gave, because I liked her definition. She wrote of her friends from this church and how they were her mentors, saying it was so good, and this is her quote, to have someone you trust that would guide you in the right direction, not making decisions for you, but guidance and food for thought in making those decisions. Now, in Marilyn's case, the people she mentioned were people that were her age. They were her peers, but she also saw them as mentors. Karen Ellis told me that her grandmother had been her mentor, getting her to church, youth group, and vacation Bible school when she was young. She also mentioned enjoying church events together with others, and there were some pivotal events that she mentioned that influenced her on her walk. For example, Pastor Gil Hubbard, who had been here, set her on the path to become a certified lay speaker. We've benefited from that here at Wall Street, I know. And Karen is also a chaplain as well. Janice Disbrow said she benefited from mentors who were at different ends of the age spectrum. One was a set of older sisters who never married that were influential in her teenage years, along with a much younger married couple, didn't have children, that worked with the youth group. These people were not only helpful in studying the Bible and learning about Christianity, but Janice said they were also good at understanding what young people need in their lives. Sharon Elliott Fox wrote of a Sunday school teacher named, the name they called her was Ma Chamberlain. When Sharon was in her preteen years, Ma was already there, ready to talk, to answer any questions that the kids had. Sometimes the kids would talk to her because they didn't want to talk to their mother about it. Always accepting and inclusive of any and all of the kids and their friends, whether they were members of the church or not. In fact, Sharon had a best friend that was Jewish, and this lady always welcomed her to the gatherings at her house as well. Only long after this mentor was gone did Sharon learn that this lady's own daughter had died when the girl was a college freshman. Ma Chamberlain's example, her teaching of love and inclusion, made a deep impression on Sharon's life. Becky Timerding said that the person that came to mind when I asked about mentors in the faith was Brother Larry Cook, who served her church as a minister of music and youth when she was in 7th to 12th grade. He led the youth choir that prepared a musical every year that was shared with churches and campsites in the different areas. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like maybe that's been passed along to us? As well, Brother Larry created opportunities for Becky and her peers to serve in leadership positions in the church, teaching children, adult Sunday school classes, serving as a choir for the Sunday worship. That's where she got her start, serving on church committees. That's pretty bold. Kids, do you want to be on this committee? Becky said personally that Brother Larry helped her grow as a church servant by asking her first to play piano for an adult Sunday school class, then to select and lead music for children's Sunday school classes, then accompanying a junior choir, and eventually to play for worship in the adult choir. It's a real apprenticeship. Debbie Wonke wrote to say that she was blessed in this church, particularly with several women, Ruth Davis, Margaret Walk, Joan Crooks, who led youth groups. Later on, she worked with Margaret Walk on a vacation Bible school we did with the downtown churches, an ecumenical one. She also mentioned her father and his good friend Ed Roth, who were also mentors to Debbie. you can see that we owe a great debt of gratitude to those mentors from the past that helped guide and develop these women to be the people who became workers for Christ, as well as our cherished friends. In Philippians 1, verse 6, it says, "He who began a good work in you will carry it out to completion until the day of Jesus Christ." We can appreciate that God started good work with the help of Christian mentors, and the church benefits today from the help that these people were given as they grew up. Now, the last time I preached, I mentioned that one thing that made me happy was that the United Methodist Church uses reason as we do our theology, as our thinking about God. And once again, we have a subtle distinction to make. Often the way we use reason in our lives, in church and out in the rest of the world, is based on knowledge and critical or analytical thinking alone. However, when reason alone is separated from wisdom and moral purpose, awful consequences can develop. We've seen what happens when humans unleash forces of nature without fully understanding what the consequences might be, or when economic decisions are based only on the bottom line. Wisdom, on the other hand, embraces reason, enriches it with the power of understanding. Mentoring can add wisdom to our development in our use of reason. We at Wall Street and in the United Methodist Church value and can offer this kind of mentoring. I've been grateful to Pastor Kathy for her mentoring of me. That's an example of someone who's chronologically younger, but is much older in the work than I am. I value her years of pastoral wisdom as she guides me. You all are to be commended for stepping up through the budget and the scholarships offered, and your welcome that you've given to support Harley as a student pastor. These have allowed his relationship with his mentoring with Kathy as well. I was talking to my brother about his experience with mentoring. He told me that when he was an officer in the Navy, he would have been a senior officer, there was a required mentoring program where senior officers were matched with somebody and forced to work with a junior officer. That was not a great success in his opinion. But when he was in his MBA course, it was strongly recommended that he find a business mentor. When he was in the Navy, he was just part-time, and he really had another job. And so he had a business mentor for the rest of his job. And he found that having a mentor-mentee relationship was mutually agreed upon was much more valuable. As our circle of sisters has shared, most mentoring is best when those who are willing to work with us come alongside us and freely share with us as mentors. I hope that you will be passing the mantle as part of what is happening here, offering it and accepting mentoring in the love of Christ, and also offering mentoring to others. I think we need t-shirts that have a church motto that says, "Come for the reconciliation and community," and then on the back it'll say, "Stay for the mentoring." All right, if you will stand, we will move on to singing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Now, Becky, remember I said we got to swing this thing.